You're listening to Energy Insiders, a weekly update on clean energy and climate policy with Renew Economy's editor Giles Parkinson and leading energy analyst David Leitch. Energy Insiders is brought to you by Evergen, providing cutting-edge energy management software for battery optimisation, virtual power plants and distributed energy resources. And Pylon, helping solar installers and retailers design high-resolution solar proposals in minutes.
Hello and welcome to this latest episode of the Energy Insiders podcast. My name is Giles Parkinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Renew Economy, the editor of the EV-focused sister site The Driven, and joining me, as usual, is ITK principal David Leitch. David, I trust you are well, and quite unusually, I can see that you're well.
Yes, Giles, we're experimenting with video, but that's of no interest to our listeners, I'm sure. Yes, I'm well. I trust the listeners are all well and enjoying things, and lots to focus on. And we've got a great interview this week looking at someone who's a bit of an expert, not just on China, having lived there while he was doing his PhD, but also can talk well about green steel and green iron ore, something which is a dream. But it's a dream that's worth pursuing, and part of my bigger focus on process heat and sectors outside of just electrifying electricity. But, we need to focus on the other big sectors in the economy, the industrial sector. It's not all about households, and there's a lot. Only 40% of electricity is consumed by households, and a lot less of total final energy use is by households. It's mainly by business and by industry and by transport. And, I think we as a community need to be looking at the totality of the solution in the context of government policy, on the assumption that we're going to have a government that actually cares about this stuff. And so it's a pleasure to have Dr. Jorrit Gosens, who is a fellow at the Centre for Climate and Energy Policy at the Crawford School of Public Policy, a great bloody school at ANU in Canberra. Jorrit Gosens, fellow at the Crawford School of Public Policy, thanks very much for joining the Energy Insiders podcast.
Well, thanks for having me on, David.
Now, I was looking at your background. We're going to be talking about green steel. I hope a fashion our audience can understand, and also about China, which is why stuff you know about. But I was intrigued when I was looking at your background on LinkedIn. I believe you're of Flemish ancestry. Is that correct?
Almost. You're about 5 kilometers off. So I'm from Holland, but I am from the very south of Holland, Noord-Brabant, which is about 5 kilometers from the border with Belgium, and then the Flanders part of Belgium. Yeah.
Yeah, I noticed when I was looking that you'd worked in the Utrecht area and also in Zwolle, two areas I've cycled around, and I remember watching an amateur soccer match when I was cycling in Zwolle in about 1983 with a guitar on the back of my push bike. But we're not going to go there. But I'm interested, you actually went off to China to do your PhD, did you?
Yes, that's right. So pretty much during my master's education, I was interested in basically the very large growth of emissions in China, and the fact that they were not really covered by any international treaty like the Kyoto Protocol. And that was a upcoming question at the time. And so I was really interested in figuring out this puzzle of how to manage the growth of a very large new industrial giant with a sensible amount of emissions growth, really.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I must say I've had an interest in China from my investment banking research experience, and I've been to tour UBS used to hold conferences in Boston and in London and in Shanghai, and in fact we went to tour a coal-fired power station when I was in Shanghai then, and it was interesting. There was such a big that we attended a solar day, and there was just such a huge audience talking about solar. It was just much bigger than solar in Australia, and that was interesting. So from all of that experience, I think we can agree that China has something for everyone, doesn't it? If you're a solar or a wind enthusiast, you can point to all the solar and wind and now batteries that have been built, and in China. But if you're a coal enthusiast, you can look at the coal consumption. Perhaps it makes you happy that China's the biggest source of carbon emissions in the world and still building, hundreds of gigawatts of new coal, even though coal electricity output is dropping. So I guess capacity factors are dropping.
No, that's right. So on that first point, I mean, China is both the good and bad side of that climate story. Because yes, as you say, up until a couple of years ago, the development of capacity of wind and solar panels, or the number of solar panels and wind panel turbines going up in China, would have been about half of total global installations. And in more recent years, that's even 2/3 of global installations. So, in that sense, you can't really blame China for not doing enough. As you say, EV markets are really very large. More than 50% of new vehicles in China are electric, so very strong development there. And this has a lot to do with active government policy. And at the same time, yes, they are still building new coal-fired power plants. And up until last year, there was actually still a small amount of growth in coal-fired output. The expectation is that will not be the case this year anymore. But it's definitely plateauing. Yes, not necessarily falling very fast just yet. The hope is, of course, that the renewables growth will continue and really start to eat into that output of coal-fired power generation over the next couple of years.
That's right. And I might make the observation that, China has been the major incremental source of oil growth for the world. And there's so strong EV policy, even though it's only passenger vehicles, and we could talk a lot about this, but I don't particularly want to spend too much time. But I reckon, Jorrit, that when you look at the data, you can already see that the oil price, to some extent, is under a little bit of pressure because EVs are subtracting from oil demand growth at the least.
Yeah, definitely, and that will continue in China even more strongly. So, of course, passenger transport is not the only demand, or it's not the only source of demand for oil. Trucking and shipping still a bit more difficult to decarbonize. And there's the petrochemicals, but definitely the passenger transport will see much less growth or much less demand for oil over the next couple of years. I think one thing that's interesting from research from my colleagues at the ANU is they've investigated a sort of peer effect. So when do people choose to buy an EV as their next vehicle? And it's basically a sort of an exponential growth curve. Basically, if there are very little people that own an EV, you are less likely to make that choice yourself. And there is a tipping point at which you see so many other users of electric vehicles that you become much more likely to buy one, to make the decision to buy one yourself as well.
It's a social thing, and I would suggest to you that maybe it's an S curve rather than just an exponential curve, because S-shaped curves are what we see in so many industries. But I don't want to talk about EVs in China today. I'm not sure how I managed to sidetrack myself so much onto that topic. It's just interesting, though. I am interested. One of the things when we look at Australia and its own decarbonisation journey is it's one thing to look at the need to decarbonise, but it's also, we think about the economics, and I don't think about the economics of electricity generation in Australia, because for me, that's already settled. I don't think about the need or the strategic benefits of having EVs in Australia, because for me, reducing oil imports is just an obvious strategic thing to do. What I do ask myself about is that we export a lot of coal, both thermal and metallurgical. We also export these days a lot of gas, LNG, which goes to China, but most particularly we export iron ore. And whereas the gas exports generate almost no impact on taxes and the budget deficit, when the iron ore price goes up or down, that's a really big impact on the federal deficit, and it's a big impact on the value of the dollar. And so I guess that's a long speech leading into the fact that what are we going to do about iron ore? And I thought we could talk about it just very generally. Australia mostly produces hematite, which is relatively low in iron content, but great for blast furnaces, whereas China itself produces already magnetite, which is not so good for blast furnaces. Is that correct?
It is sort of. So hematite ores versus magnetite ores. The starting grade, so the iron grade as it comes out of the ground, is actually usually higher for hematite than magnetite. The difference is in how easily it is upgraded. So magnetite, because it's magnetic, the process for upgrading it is you grind it and you use a magnet to pick up the iron-bearing material, and it's easy and efficient to upgrade that from as low as 20% iron to as high as 70% iron. Whereas with hematite, it's not a magnetic form of iron oxide, and therefore the process is grinding, flotation, and it's a much less efficient process, and you lose a lot of iron to your waste streams. So you prefer not to beneficiate it too much at all. And that's where the benefit for the blast furnace comes in. In the blast furnace, that sort of other material, the stuff that's not iron, gets removed really quite very easily because everything melts and separates. And so you don't really need a very high grade of iron ore. And because it's so cheaply mined in Australia, that's why it's preferred by blast furnace operators. If it was cheaper to mine magnetite, they would just as happily use magnetite ores.
Hey, that's a terrific explanation. And I think just for reference, China's at least 50% of world steel production, as it is of so many commodities. And I think Australia is something like a third of global iron ore production.
No, a good bit more. 60% of global iron. I should say seaborne exports market. That's a difference actually. So total global production, I actually cannot say.
But 60% of the seaborne trade, and a very large part of that goes to China almost by definition, and then it also goes to Japan. Whereas India, I think, the other big country, has its own iron ore. Am I thinking about that?
That's right. So roughly 70% of our iron ore goes to China. The rest goes to Taiwan, Japan, Korea. India, as you say, is a big market, but it has its own. It's almost perfectly self-sufficient. Yeah.
And I guess the other point in the carbon context is that blast furnace steel, or steel in total, represents, what is it, about 8% of global carbon emissions?
Yeah, that's about right. Yeah. It's a number that deserves some updating. Probably it's more closer to 9 or maybe 10% by now because of the growth of steel output and the reduction in other sectors. But about that, let's say 8 or 9%. In China, because they are such a steel intensive economy, it's about double that. So 16, 17, 18% of Chinese emissions is from the iron and steel sector.
And that's despite the fact that they've also got all this coal-fired electricity.
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah.
And so this kind of, for Australia, then, the next point I think to make is that hematite, because it goes into blast furnaces, has been the economic way to do it. but it's not necessarily going to be using hematite is kind of a problem when we want to produce low carbon steel.
Um, that is, yeah, that's a bit of a rumor that is deserves some qualification, I think. At the moment, basically the alternative to the blast furnace route is via the electric arc furnace. You first make iron in a process called direct reduction of iron, or DRI, and then you put that DRI into an electric arc furnace for conversion to steel. That electric arc furnace really requires a very high grade of iron, or very high grade of iron ore.
And I think, doesn't it also mostly a lot of electric arc furnaces actually use scrap steel, and it's the availability of scrap steel that kind of drives the attractiveness of electric arc steel making.
No, that's exactly right. That's why they were designed. That's what the machine is for. They can also be used to process DRI, but only of a very high grade of iron, because it's not so very effective at basically removing the iron from other stuff. That's the pollutants or impurities that are in the DRI, in the iron, and therefore in the iron ore that's used to make the iron. However, there is also a third route. It's a piece of equipment called an electric smelter furnace. So it's purely runs purely on electricity, and it's used also to make iron. And as the name says, smelter furnace. So it melts the material completely, and just the same as in the blast furnace, that means that the iron material gets separated from all the other stuff, and so you can quite efficiently separate the two out. And electricity, of course, can very easily be made completely renewable, completely low carbon.
Now, let's just talk about, I'm interested, so I don't want to get too technical at all, but it is interesting because I've seen aluminium smelters lots of times, which I guess most of our listeners have not done. But in what is the actual melting process? Is the iron ore go into a big pot and then it's just electricity applied to melt it? Is that how it works?
Yes, there would be very large electrodes that would be sunk into the bath of iron ore, very large current flowing through it, and that melts it. Yeah.
And as far I hadn't heard until I went to listen to the ANU presentation at Smart Energy recently about an electric steel smelter. Do they actually exist in the real world?
They do, but it is at a very much smaller scale. So that is the point you still make. With current technologies, it's true that the route to produce green steel is via the electric arc furnace route, which requires very high grades of iron ore. However, there's a process under development called the electric smelter furnace. Fortescue is building one, and a consortium called HiSmelt, I think, is building one in Guyana that includes BlueScope and BHP, from the top of my head.
And these would be like not laboratory scale, but demonstration plant still.
Yeah, of a size of I should look that up actually, but definitely not laboratory. More like 1,000,000 tons. I would think of that scale. I don't have that number.
That's okay. Now let me ask: what kind of iron ores could you put into that furnace? Could you put hematite? Or I mean, it comes down to the iron grade and the impurities, as we've mentioned. And could you just use the iron ore that we currently export? Could that go into such a furnace?
Yes, and that is pretty much exactly the point for Australian iron ore miners to try and develop that technology from current scales, where it is not exactly lab scale, but smaller scale, into something more of an industrial scale. That piece of machinery, because it melts the material. Impurities can be very efficiently removed, and that is the point for them, because that then allows the use of fairly low grade, meaning 50%, 52% iron ore that we mine in the Pilbara, and which is the bulk of global iron ore at the moment still, of course.
Because it works in blast furnaces. Now, excuse me, and you're talking with a financial analyst here, but a blast furnace also melts the iron ore, does it, by just directly heating it with coal-fired heat? Yeah.
That's right. So in that sense, the smelter furnace and the blast furnace are the same. They are very efficient at removing impurities because they melt it, and then the impurities and the iron just completely separate. The difference being that in a blast furnace you use coking coal to provide the energy to do that, and in a smelter furnace you would use electricity, which can be completely renewable.
It can be. But using metallurgical coal, which has a lot of energy per ton, that's basically what a difference. It's actually an efficient way to burn coal, in the sense that you don't have to waste a lot of it to make electricity in the way the coal-fueled electricity is. So, I mean, what I'm trying to say here is that using coal to make steel through a blast furnace is a relatively economic way to do it, unless you price carbon.
No, that's right. And I do have to say, so it is a two-step iron making process. So you would still first make DRI, and then you would melt the DRI in a smelter furnace. The DRI making would be with hydrogen, which is also generated from renewable electricity, and that would perform the function of the reductant, so removing the oxygen from the iron ore, which is in a blast furnace. The coal does both of that. It removes the oxygen and it melts the material. In that process, those two are separated. It's quite clear that is quite a bit more expensive than current practices. Definitely than the blast furnace. Yes. If we would try to compare the two processes, it's always a bit of a difficulty, because you don't really know how costly your hydrogen is going to be. That's still more forecast than actual market numbers for that. But we expect roughly that carbon prices would need to be $100 to $150 US dollars in order for hydrogen-based steelmaking to be competitive with blast furnace steelmaking.
And so that's still about double. I haven't looked at the European carbon price lately, but it's clearly higher than any carbon price currently is pretty much around the world, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, the European market has seen levels that high, not consistently. If you would think of the Chinese carbon market, I mean, right now the steel industry in China is not included in the carbon market even. It's going to happen from next year on. But carbon prices in China have been roughly around $5 US. So a very big gap still.
And we should talk a little bit about that, because China has a carbon pricing scheme, but my sense is it's mainly just to give all the players a sense of how the rules of the game work, rather than with any serious intent of achieving anything right now. It's so that we can all China can get used to a tool which the government could make work if it wanted to.
Yeah, I think that's not that's not cynical to say it like that. I think that's pretty correct. It is currently, with those prices, it's a fairly ineffective tool at actually reducing carbon emissions. It's also not a system with a total cap as the EU, where you just say this is the total amount of emissions that we'll tolerate. It's an intensity based mechanism. So if you produce a kilowatt hour of electricity, you are given an amount of carbon emission quota. So the more you produce, the higher your quota are. It's just about how much cleaner or less clean than the average benchmark you are. That gets traded. And I think you're right. I think for the power sector and from next year onwards, steel, alumina, and cement will be included. It's mostly about setting up the system of accounting, monitoring, reporting. And at some point in the future, they've signaled this already in policy text, there will be an absolute cap, and that cap will come down, and will possibly become an actual effective tool to help them roll out their net zero carbon agenda.
Jorrit, you can remind me, but I've just read only today that the USA, for the first time ever, is not actually reporting its carbon emissions, even though they've done all the work. But and the report's ready to be released. But my thought is that in China, they don't actually formally report their annual emissions. We in the rest of the world have to actually calculate them, or have I not understood that properly?
No, that's all countries, including China, have those obligations to report those emissions to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I would say so. The United States has not done that this year. That's unfortunate. I don't think that the Chinese will enormously care about that.
All right, I've misunderstood that. Let's not spend some time on it. But perhaps while we're in China, could you talk a little bit about the general state of policy at the moment? Because I think anyone could get confused by the simultaneous growth of solar, wind, electric vehicles, and steel production and construction recoveries, and it's everything for everyone. And I'm not quite sure. I think I read recently from the CREF that in fact it's getting more and more difficult for China to actually achieve even its intensity carbon policy. How would you describe the state of play in China at the moment?
Yeah, so I think important to understand is that so China has a number of different goals. The overarching one is the net zero goals, which say by 2030 or before 2030, we want to achieve peak carbon emissions. So we want to have the maximum carbon emissions in history. And from that point, from that peak, it'll have to come down to zero, net zero by 2060. That peak in carbon emissions before 2030 is actually not an enormously ambitious target. That's sort of expected based on usual factors like economic growth, efficiency improvements that we have seen historically. The net zero by 2060 target is seen as very ambitious indeed. For the last couple of years, we have indeed seen that enormous improvement in or rollout of wind and solar, but also a continued growth of the coal-fired power sector, also continued support of the steel sector. So, and this has been driven basically by a number of economic shocks that China has had to deal with. So, and that includes COVID, but also just slowing economic growth and slowing a bit faster than the government had imagined.
Well, when we come to steel, of course, it's construction, and I was a building materials analyst as well as a utilities analyst, and it's always all building booms end badly, without exception. It's just a question of whether they end slowly, like Japan had for 20 years, or whether they end very suddenly, like might happen in Florida or Ireland or somewhere. China clearly had far too many housing units. I think it was 20 million housing units a year they were building, which could never be sustained. And construction was a ridiculous share of GDP. And that has to come down and that has to produce an issue for the iron ore industry as well as the cement industry, does it not?
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, especially long term, if you look at the long-term forecast of what the population of China is going to be, I think it's expected to be around a third of today, in about 50 years from now. So quite clearly, their housing stock is already oversupplied. It's also true that the number of analysts that have said that surely China will not be producing any more steel than last year, that is something that
You can be wrong a lot of times.
yeah, people have been saying that for 10, 15 years.
Isn't the famous economist joke that to have predicted 3 out of the last 1 recessions? Sorry, let's keep going.
That could be it's similar, but yeah, but even if that's true, I think that we genuinely are at that point where we won't see steel output growing in China anymore. I think including because we're seeing increasing amounts of exports of the material, which is a great release valve for an industry. However, it's also true that the steel sector is enormously unprofitable. And so effectively exporting steel for China becomes subsidizing the rest of the world with cheap steel. And I don't think that they will keep doing that for a whole lot longer. And as you say, domestic demand will start to drop off because the building boom definitely seems to be unwinding. So yes, steel production will start to come down in China.
It's hard to be too optimistic about it, which brings us back to where we were on iron ore. So we've talked about electric smelted steel, but it's not really a thing at the moment. And we're talking about also what's going to happen to Australia's iron ore, because at the moment, if we don't bet on electric smelted steel and there's still a need for green steel, then Australia's focus on hematite or hematite resource is not necessarily a great resource. I think you've ANU put together some kind of model that looks at what the hydrogen price would need to be, Australia versus China, to understand how competitive Australian green iron ore could be as an export product. Is that what you did?
No, that's right. So exactly that modeling, we've been developing that. That looks at all these different technologies. So the blast furnace route, electric arc furnace, and electric smelter furnace routes, all the different types of iron ore that are mined globally, and then what the cheapest way would be to decarbonize steel production, really. And what we see is that there would still be demand for Australian iron ore, definitely, regardless of what the hydrogen prices would be in Australia or China. So iron ore demand from Australia is fairly secured. The question is whether we would start to produce the iron in Australia. So there's a very large hope, or there's optimism around the idea that we could use our really very good quality renewable energy resources here in Australia to produce the iron and possibly other decarbonized commodities for export to the region instead of just producing the iron ore. And in order to be able to do that, we have calculated we would need to be able to produce green hydrogen at a cost of roughly $0.50 Australian dollar below what they would do in China.
Now, can I just ask there, is that the delivered cost in China or the production cost in Australia?
That's the production cost in Australia, yeah, of the hydrogen.
Because right, okay. So 50 cents less than what the production cost in China might be.
That's right.
And so everyone always likes to say that Australian renewable electricity is very cheap, but actually This is a topic that is dear to my heart. It's not necessarily that cheap. It's true that we have a very good solar and a pretty good wind resource, but our capital costs and a lot of other things and transmission requirements and all of that, I would argue that the prices that are bid in for renewable electricity in China, and you can tell me about this, but the wind procurement, and I'm never quite sure if I'm looking at like for like, whether that represents, the levelized cost of electricity or the price required to earn cost of capital, whether those bids in China reflect that or just reflect something else. But it seems to me that those bids are less than the prices that Australian developers want for their wind and solar projects.
Yeah, so it is actually quite difficult to find like for like sort of cost comparisons from what you call market intelligence in China, because of the fact that everything in the electricity market is so subject to regulation. So up until recently, or let's say many years ago, there was a feed-in tariff for solar and wind projects. More recently, that has been dropped, but that still meant that they were receiving sort of the on-grid price, as they call it, the benchmark on-grid price, which is the same price as coal-fired power generators were receiving.
And which I might add, when you work the numbers through, comes to well over 100 Australian dollars, that on-grid price, as far as I can see from looking at the big state-owned generators. So it's not like the electricity on-grid is that cheap in China at the point of production. It might be cheap once you cover the transmission costs and everything to the consumer somewhere along the line, but it's not that cheap at the point of production.
No, exactly. Those on-grid prices are quite generous, and that too has now just last year been let go. So there's more of a competition in merchant markets for wind and solar, which means that we will finally see what developers are actually expecting in terms of a return for their projects. And in terms of the competition between Australia and China, like, is it possible that we would produce hydrogen that much cheaper than the Chinese? I think you're right. We have fantastic renewable energy resources. But I think it's especially the labor costs that are still a problem, especially in the locations where our resources are the best, which is the Pilbara region, really. Labor is just fantastically expensive there. So that's a challenge. We have done modeling of those hydrogen production costs as well, and we think that it is somewhat challenging, maybe, can be fixed with government subsidies to be competitive with the prices in the Chinese market. But we would be able to produce it at competitive costs versus the Japanese, Korean, Taiwanese, and even Indian markets.
That's right, because in the end, the electrolyzers in China are going to be pretty cheap when China gets round to really trying on those. I don't know, have you seen anything recent about what's happening to it? I haven't been following the hydrogen market so closely recently, because I came to the conclusion it was still a few years away, but I guess China is still going at it fairly hard, like they go at everything.
Yes, that's true. However, if you would look at different forecasts, and I think the best example is the forecast from the International Energy Agency. They put out a global hydrogen review every year. The forecasts from 4 years ago were more optimistic, and they have been getting more pessimistic year after year after year. The reason for that is that the forecasts, basically, it's very easy to sort of predict the price of these electrolyzers 10 years from now, if you have a good idea of what global installations already are. That sort of predicts your price.
So the learning rate drives down the cost, but you've got to get and we haven't hit takeoff yet, and so we're not seeing the cost reductions because in fact no one's buying the bloody things.
That's sort of right. We understand what the learning rate would be, and we have been predicting the costs based on the announcements, basically, in all sorts of MOUs and whatnot. And not all of those projects have actually come to pass, and actually quite a few of them. So yeah,
I wish I had $1 for every MOU I'd heard announced.
that's been the problem there. Yeah.
I think we've covered a lot of ground on an introduction to a topic, and I think it's wonderful to hear you talking, because you do understand what's going on in China and also about steel. And I don't think anyone who looks at this topic seriously and understands that it takes great big global multinationals generally to build these iron ore and steel and iron plants, they're not going to do it unless they're pretty confident of the outcome. But it's great to talk about this and see where we are on this journey, and to be able to follow where China's going as well. So if you have any final things that you wanted our listeners to, or me to, understand, I'd be grateful to hear them.
Yeah, no. So I think everything the way you described the problem, the size of the problem, is about right. It's a difficult nut to crack. Technologies are not yet mature yet, and capital is not yet moving at enormous pace either. But I think it's also true that if we look back to the early 2000s, at what PV capacity was back then, people would have laughed you away if you would tell them what installation rates were last year. Definitely. So yes, this is a difficult industry to decarbonize, but I think there's enough stubbornness in those large industrial companies as well, that this is going to come off. The question is how quickly. Yeah.
And it's something, of course, that Australia could research, because we have a direct interest. It's worth putting research money at absolute minimum into doing it, would be my comment. And from a global perspective, my ultimate optimism about things like this always comes from the fact that the scientific need is overwhelming. And when you can demonstrate the science so clearly, in the end, in a changing road up and down, but the policy and the economics will follow the science. That has always been the case, I think. And so, thank you very much, Jorrit Gosens, for talking to Energy Insiders today. It's been a most enjoyable conversation.
Yeah, thanks for that, David.
And that was Jorrit Gosens from the Crawford School at the ANU. We'll be back after this break with discussion of that, and also the latest news from around the country. You are back with the Energy Insiders podcast with Giles Parkinson and David Leach. David, I didn't manage to join that interview, as people can probably tell, because I was busy picking up my grandson from the local airport. But your big takeaways?
Well, my big takeaway is that there's a lot to learn about green steel and green iron ore, and it's this process of converting iron ore into iron, where the theoretical science is advancing, and where I think more research can be done. And I think what I learned out of that again is that Australia's always had expertise at extracting iron ore and in financial services, but we've also got expertise in education. And one of the products we can export from Australia is advanced education. As everyone knows, Australia was instrumental in the development of solar, and we can do a lot more going forward if higher education is supported to the extent that I think it should be. We're a smart country. We need smart people in this country, and we need to fund them appropriately.
Or we can import them from the US. There seems to be a lot of smart people wanting to live there at the moment. That's an option. Let's have a look at some of the news of the week, David. I guess the big one this week was the release, finally, of the Southwest Renewable Energy Zone grid access rights. Now, this is the first major tender to be announced for. We've seen tenders for underwriting agreements and all sorts of things. This is for the access, your right to access the grid in these new renewable energy zones. And it's an interesting outcome. As expected, Yanco Delta from Origin Energy got the biggest pie, 1.5 gigawatt wind farm. AGL and Somerva also got the go-ahead for a pared-down Pottinger Energy Park. Spark Renewables, once an offshoot of Transgrid, I think, now owned by a Thai company, Malaysian company. That's true with the Dinwan Renewable Energy Hub, and they've got a pared-down allocation, less than half what they originally envisaged their capacity. And then there's a surprise there, the Baywa wind farm, which has only got about, less than a third of its capacity. But there's a whole bunch of projects missing out. Look, this is a great step forward. This Southwest Renewable Zone, which I guess 5 to 10 years ago was largely ignored as a resource, has now been unlocked. But it's also been seen as a bit of a missed opportunity because there's just so much capacity that at this stage can't be unlocked because the grid that they've built around it isn't big enough. They've kind of like built a Sydney Harbour Bridge with two lanes on it and gone, well, that's great, but you're not going to get all the cars across to the other side, and you're not going to be able to transport all the wind to where the load is.
And on top of that, some of the transmission will be hogged from time to time by Snowy. Once Snowy Hydro 2 is operational, although I think people less worried about that happening anytime soon, but still, it remains an issue. Look, it's clear from a discussion we had with Transgrid CEO Brett Redman at least a year ago that there's little or no appetite for expanding HumeLink. The REZ capacity is less than was originally contemplated anyway, because it's not just the immediate transmission links, it's all the rest of the connections up to Sydney, and in fact down to Victoria and to South Australia. And there's a lot of things about this REZ that one is it's a great site for building wind for reasons that we've discussed before. But the thing that strikes me every time I look at the map is that it's where three transmission lines meet up. But potentially the V&I West, which is a 500 kilovolt line at the moment from Melbourne and connects up with HumeLink that takes power up to Sydney, and with Project Energy Connect that goes back to South Australia. So it's a great interchange in something that'll be familiar to all of us road drivers. And whilst it's probably not time or not even that much point in some ways upgrading the South Australian link, it would be fantastic if we could upgrade the New South Wales link. But, Transgrid's track record at getting on with things is at a reasonable cost is questioned by some people. But I do think within the planning, there's still the possibility of making an even bigger V&I West and Western Renewables link. And in that way, you could get a huge amount of power from that Western zone in New South Wales, the Riverina, down to Melbourne, and perhaps at a more economical cost than building HumeLink right out, or at least you could do it quicker and more. Sorry, not HumeLink, but offshore wind, which Victoria's gone big on, and which there's a lot of cost questions. So it's still time to have a strategy planning session on it.
Yeah, well, it's going to be interesting to see what changes in the next ISP, because there's certainly lots of proposals. I mean, as you said, the Southwest Renewable Energy Zone's got a fantastic wind resource. It's also got great community support. And a lot of those big projects have gone through planning approvals with no objections because it's sparsely populated. It's got very flat land, so the logistical problems aren't significant. And so it's actually cheaper to build some of those projects and move the equipment there. It seems that part of the problem came from this inability to sort of properly assess the wind resource that's there. Now, the ISP has been using CSIRO satellite data, which put the wind resource at around just under 30%, but most of the developers have gone in there and used these anemometers, these little propellers that sort of just on big mass have discovered that the capacity factor is far more significant, so more than 40%. It's why you saw less capacity awarded in the current zone, and now people are trying to think of ways of actually doing something about unlocking the rest of these projects. There's a couple of scenarios which I think we've discussed before about having these big sort of virtual transmission, these big batteries acting as shock absorbers, which can double the capacity of the Project Energy Connect when it's finished. possibly unlocking more distribution, and finding some way of getting more capacity into that area, because they say it's probably cheaper and going to be easier than even developing something like the New England Renewable Zone, which faces local opposition, major transmission costs, and logistical issues. So it's going to be interesting to see how that actually evolves over the coming months.
Yes, as I understand it, Giles, and I don't, but nevertheless, what I'm told is that the wind resource is up higher. So you could, with the new turbines, you can build them higher in the air, and they capture. It's very flat land out there, so you don't get much interference, and all the wind just rocks through. I fly my model planes out in those areas. Delta Yanko is very close to Jerilderie, a place where Ned Kelly robbed a bank in the 1800s, and it scared the bankers so much that there are now no banks there. Not much else there either, but nevertheless, it's quite windy there, and persistently windy.
And yes, and look, I mean, judging by some of the reports, the capacity factors of some of those projects is about 44%, which is about 50% more than what was estimated in the ISP. So
now, another thing about it is, I think, as you discussed, the councils down there have learnt from what's gone on in other areas. And one of the things about the Arana zone, which is the zone that's immediately under development, is that very, very gradually the state government and the councils are coming to understand that by working together, they can look at the REZ-wide project, even if it's not done quite as formally as you might think. And so councils have sort of jumped up and down about accommodation and lack of roads, and how councils are. And the New South Wales government has listened, I suppose, is one way of putting it. Everyone's listened. And now we're going to see a government-funded road upgrade. And the point is that you build these wind farms one after another. Although it's 4 or 5 years construction for one wind farm, when you're doing 3 or 4 of them in a row, you're actually going to get like an extended period of development and work and businesses. It will eventually fade out. But in that time, there's a lot of changes to the REZ-wide GDP, the economy there, and having some long-term good roads, some good telecommunications infrastructure, some good temporary accommodation is going to boost the area long-term, but also enable the initial development of it to go much more smoothly if people don't have to sit behind a semi-trailer carrying a wind turbine for a couple of hours grumbling.
No, look, that's exactly right. And so the $127 million, I think, is going to be spent on the first series of upgrades of roads from Newcastle out towards Gulgong and Dubbo, I think, mostly along the Golden Highway, which has a whole bunch of pinch points for those 80-meter long blades and transformers, which weigh several hundred tons and can only be sort of transported at the dead of night, but not always able to do the whole route then, and has all sorts of issues. Look, a couple of other things I just wanted to mention, David, before we sign off. Project Energy Connect, we've mentioned Project Energy Connect. It forms the backbone of the Southwest Renewable Energy Zone. The first part of it, which got built on time and on budget by Electronet, which went from Robertstown in South Australia to Barunga in New South Wales and then Redcliffs in Victoria, is now operating. It's increased the transfer capacity between in and out of South Australia by around 150 megawatts, and we're already seeing the results of that with new sort of wind output records, sort of instantaneous, daily. We're seeing the new Goyder South wind farm going through its hold points. That's the biggest wind project in South Australia. So I think we'll finally, after a couple of years of sort of fairly static growth, we'll now see the South Australia sort of leap beyond its sort of average of about 72% wind and solar over the last couple of years to above 80%. Thanks to that new wind farm, thanks to that new transfer capacity, and thanks also to the biggest battery in the state, Blythe Battery. I just wanted to point that out, which is also built on time and on budget, despite some issues with some grid-forming inverters. But anyway.
And we'll talk about batteries another time, because there's always something to talk about with batteries. But just on solar farms, didn't I read on your site that there's some solar farm quite large that's actually getting built ahead of schedule, months and months ahead of schedule?
Yes, I know. Look, it's remarkable. Look, we've sort of talked so much about delays and things like that, but look, some solar farms actually do get built on time, on budget, or even ahead of time and ahead of budget. I think we're also seeing the two big Collie batteries over in Western Australia.
Which solar farm was that, Giles? I know to put you on the spot, but can you? I just wanted to congratulate the developers at being able to do that, because it is a relatively scarce thing.
David, now I'm going to go and find out which solar farm it is.
Well, nevertheless.
It's Acciona's, the Aldoga solar farm. I should know that actually, off the top of my head, which has actually been provided for Stanwell Corp. Is taking most of the output from that.
So let's yes. So it's the Acciona solar farm. They've been a bit slow on the McIntyre wind farm, but the solar seems to have gone well. It's for Stanwell and goes to emphasise, which I'm fond of saying, how well Stanwell did in the previous 4 years at really getting Queensland a move along.
Yeah, well, that's right. Yes, and quite opposite to the ructions that are happening in its sister company, CS Energy, which has suffered another exodus, or forced exodus of chief executive and the head of the Callide coal plant. Quite an extraordinary situation, really, with a decision by the LNP government to extend the life of the Callide B. Some of the experts and the locals there say if you're going to extend the life of any coal plant in Queensland, then you probably wouldn't choose Callide B because it's old and it's unreliable. And just a couple of days before this announcement, the Callide C coal plant went boom again. And then the Queensland government sort of said, "Oh well, look, we weren't told of the severity of it," but they don't seem to want to admit that they would have changed their decision anyway. They seem quite attached with this whole idea of keeping coal plants running for as long as possible, building new gas plants, and not building very much in the way of renewables. So we shall see.
And so that's probably a bit of a wrap for this week. Once again, thanking our sponsors, Giles, which I'll hand over to you to do as yes.
Yes, Pylon Energy and Evergen. Thank you very much for your ongoing continued support. Thanks everyone for listening to this podcast.
And I want to mention that I'm a continued user of Evergen, and it's been great in my household.
Oh, there you go. Thanks for Jorrit Gosens for joining us to talk to us about sort of China and the green steel opportunities. Do check out some of our other podcast series elsewhere on our website, the Switched On podcast and the Solar Insiders podcast. We're actually sort of talking to some of the more interesting independent and smaller party candidates with a view to the election that's coming up at the end of next week. Really interesting interview with Kate Hook, who's running in Clare. She's been a renewable energy advocate, and this is around Lithgow and Bathurst, which is a centre of what has been a coal centre. It's where the coalition wants to build nuclear, and it's where we're seeing lots of proposals for new batteries, pumped hydro, and wind and solar farms. Really, really interesting interview, and we've got some others as well with Allegra Spender, others coming up next week. So Nicolette Bowler, that's what I was going to say, which I think is actually in your electorate, David, running there. So we shall see.
Yes, running very strongly, and she's worked incredibly hard for the past 3 years. But anyway.
Okay, well, thanks for that. Thanks, everyone. And we'll be back with another episode of the Energy Inside podcast next week. Bye for now, and enjoy the Anzac weekend.
Energy Insiders was brought to you by Evergen, the market-leading renewable energy software business that optimises residential and commercial solar and battery systems. Evergen enables large numbers of systems to operate as a single fleet, so network operators can use them as a virtual power plant, generating significant value for consumers, network operators, and the energy system as a whole. Evergen software is powering the energy system of the future. Energy Insiders was also brought to you by Pylon. Pylon provides easy-to-use solar design software for installers and retailers with pay-as-you-go pricing, no monthly cost and no lock-in contracts. Join Australia's top solar companies who trust Pylon to design high-resolution, CEC-ready solar proposals.